Few figures in African history have shaped the destiny of a nation as profoundly as Jomo Kenyatta. He was not merely the first president of an independent Kenya. He was a scholar, an anthropologist, a political prisoner, a symbol of resistance, and ultimately the father of his nation. To understand Kenya today, you must understand the man who spent decades fighting for its freedom. Jomo Kenyatta's life is the story of the African liberation struggle itself, with all its complexities, triumphs, and contradictions. From the rolling hills of Gatundu to the halls of the London School of Economics, from the dusty streets of Nairobi to the prison camps of Kapenguria, Kenyatta's journey mirrors the journey of an entire continent emerging from the shadow of colonial rule. This course will take you through every chapter of his extraordinary life, presenting the historical facts, the political context, and the human being behind the legend. By the end, you will understand why Kenyatta is revered as the Mzee, the wise elder, and why his legacy remains both celebrated and debated to this day. Jomo Kenyatta was born as Kamau Wa Njenji in the village of Gatundu, in the Kikuyu Highlands of British East Africa, probably in the 1890s. The exact year of his birth remains uncertain, as it was never officially recorded. Historians place it between 1891 and 1897. This uncertainty itself speaks volumes about the colonial conditions in which he was born. The British had established the East Africa Protectorate in 1895, and the Kikuyu people, who inhabited the fertile lands around Mount Kenya, were among the first to feel the weight of colonial encroachment. Kamau's father, Njenji Wa Muigai, was a respected elder in the community. His mother, Wambui, was Njenji's third wife. Kamau grew up in a traditional Kikuyu homestead, surrounded by the customs, rituals, and oral traditions of his people. He learned to tend livestock, to respect the elders, and to understand the deep spiritual connection the Kikuyu had with the land. The land was not merely soil, it was the source of life, the resting place of ancestors, and the foundation of identity. When Kamau was a young boy, his father died. His mother then married his father's brother, a common practice in Kikuyu society that ensured the continuity of the family. Kamau's life took a decisive turn when he decided to attend the Scottish mission school at Gatundu, near Nairobi. The missionaries offered education, but they also sought to erase African culture. They gave their students Christian names, forbade them from speaking Kikuyu, and taught them that their ancestral traditions were pagan and primitive. Kamau was baptized John Peter, though he would later abandon this name. At Gatundu, Kamau learned to read and write in English and Swahili. He studied the Bible, arithmetic, and basic history. But he also witnessed the contradictions of colonialism firsthand. The missionaries preached equality and love, yet the colonial system was built on racial hierarchy and exploitation. The Kikuyu lands were being seized by white settlers through a series of legal mechanisms that favored European landowners. The Crown Lands Ordinance of 1915 declared all land in the colony to be Crown land, effectively extinguishing African customary land rights. The Kikuyu were forced to pay taxes in British currency, forcing them to work for low wages on European farms under conditions little better than serfdom. They were subjected to the Tukipande system, a humiliating identity card that all African men had to carry at all times, modeled on the South African pass laws. To be caught without one was a criminal offense punishable by imprisonment and a fine. These injustices planted the seeds of political consciousness in young Kamau. He saw the members of his extended family displaced from their ancestral lands, reduced to squatting on European farms where they had once owned the soil. He saw the traditional Kikuyu system of governance, the councils of elders known as the Kayama, systematically dismantled by colonial administrators who appointed compliant chiefs in their place. He saw the erosion of Kikuyu cultural practices, the mockery of their customs, and the imposition of foreign legal systems that treated African testimony as inherently unreliable. In 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, Kamau left the mission school and moved to Nairobi. He found work as a clerk in the colonial administration. Nairobi in those years was a segregated city, a colonial creation that had grown from a railway depot into a bustling but divided urban center. Africans lived in cramped quarters in the Eastlands neighborhoods, Pumwani, Bahati, and Kariokor, barred from certain streets and businesses. Europeans enjoyed wide avenues, stone houses, electricity, and piped water. the divide was not merely spatial but social and legal. Africans could not walk on certain sidewalks, could not enter certain hotels or restaurants, and were subject to a nighttime curfew. Kamau saw this apartheid-like system every day in the streets of Nairobi. He also became involved in the Kikuyu political movements that were beginning to emerge. In the 1920s, one of the most important was the Kikuyu Central Association, KCA, founded in 1924 by James Buter, Joseph Kangathi, and other early nationalists. The KCA was the first organized political body representing African interests in Kenya. It protested land seizures, forced labor, the Kipande system, and the denial of African education and economic opportunity. It sent petitions to the colonial government and to the colonial office in London. It published newspapers in Kikuyu and Swahili. It organized public meetings and agitating for change. In 1928, the KCA sent a delegation to London to present their grievances directly to the British government. Kamau, now calling himself Johnston Kamau, was chosen as the delegation's representative. He would spend the next 17 years in Europe, transforming himself from a colonial clerk into an internationally recognized intellectual and political leader. It was in London that he adopted the name by which the world would come to know him, Jomo Kenyatta. Jomo means a burning spear in Kikuyu. Kenyatta was the name of a beaded belt that he frequently wore. The burning spear was an appropriate symbol for the fire that now burned within him, a fire of resistance, of knowledge, and of the unshakable conviction that his people deserved to be free. Kenyatta arrived in London in 1929. He was a young man from a colonized land, now walking the streets of the imperial capital. The contrast was staggering. London was the heart of the British Empire, the city from which governors, generals, and administrators ruled over a quarter of the world. For Kenyatta, it became a university of political education. He did not simply lobby British officials. He immersed himself in the radical political currents of the time. He met with the Communist Party of Great Britain, whose anti-colonial stance attracted many African nationalists. He traveled to the Soviet Union in 1930, visiting Moscow and meeting with Comintern leaders. He studied at the Moscow State University, where he was exposed to Marxist theory. However, Kenyatta was never a doctrinaire communist. He was a pragmatist who absorbed ideas from wherever they could help his cause. The most intellectually transformative period of Kenyatta's European years was his time at the London School of Economics, LSE, and University College London. Under the supervision of the renowned Polish anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, Kenyatta wrote a groundbreaking anthropological study of his own people. This work, originally a doctoral thesis, was published in 1938 under the title Facing Mount Kenya, The Tribal Life of the Kikuyu. Facing Mount Kenya was a revolutionary book. It was one of the first anthropological works written by an African about his own culture, in his own voice. In it, Kenyatta systematically dismantled the colonial narrative that African societies were primitive and disorganized. He described in meticulous detail the sophisticated social, political, economic, and religious systems of the Kikuyu people. He explained how the Kikuyu government was a democratic system based on councils of elders. He described the age-grade system, the initiation rituals, the marriage customs, and the land tenure system. He showed that the Kikuyu had a complex system of property rights, with individual and clan ownership clearly defined. He argued that colonialism was not bringing civilization to Africa but was destroying a civilization that already existed. Facing Mount Kenya became an essential text in the Pan-African movement. It influenced thinkers like Kwame Nkrumah, George Padmore, and C. L. R. James. It also established Kenyatta as a serious intellectual, not just a political agitator. During his years in London, Kenyatta also became heavily involved in Pan-Africanist circles. He attended the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945, organized by George Padmore and W. E. L. B. Du Bois. This Congress was a turning point in the African liberation struggle. For the first time, African and Caribbean intellectuals gathered not merely to petition for reforms, but to demand full independence. Kenyatta worked alongside Kwame Nkrumah, the future president of Ghana, and other leading figures of the African diaspora. They debated strategies, shared ideas, and forged alliances that would shape the post-war decolonization of Africa. But London also hardened Kenyatta. He was frustrated by the British government's refusal to listen to African demands. He watched as the Colonial Office stonewalled every delegation, promised reforms that never came, and dismissed African grievances as the work of a few agitators. He realized that petitions and polite diplomacy would never win freedom. Only organized mass struggle could achieve that. When he finally returned to Kenya in 1946, after 17 years abroad, Kenyatta was a different man. He was no longer Johnston Kamau, the mission school boy. He was Jomo Kenyatta, a scholar, a Pan-Africanist, and a nationalist leader ready to lead his people to freedom. Kenyatta returned to a Kenya that was seething with anger and frustration. The Second World War had profoundly changed the colony. Thousands of African soldiers had fought for the British Empire in Burma, Ethiopia, and North Africa. They had seen white men killed and defeated. They had tasted equality in the trenches. They returned home expecting respect and reward. Instead, they found the same racist system, the same land seizures, the same poverty. The Kenya African Union, KAU, had been founded in 1944 as a successor to the KCA. When Kenyatta returned, he was immediately elected president of the KAU. He began traveling across the country, speaking to massive crowds in Kikuyu, Swahili, and English. His message was clear and powerful: Africans must unite, demand their rights, and reclaim their land. But the political situation was spinning out of the control of moderate leaders. In the early 1950s, a secret movement was growing among the Kikuyu, Embu, and Meri peoples. This movement came to be known as Mau Mau. The Mau Mau was a complex phenomenon. It was part political insurgency, part religious movement, and part peasant revolt. Its members took oaths of loyalty, binding themselves to the cause of land and freedom. The oaths were deeply rooted in Kikuyu tradition, using rituals and symbols that carried immense emotional weight. The Mau Mau fighters, who called themselves the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, retreated to the forests of Mount Kenya and the Aberdare Range. From there, they launched attacks on European settlers, African collaborators, and government installations. The British response was brutal. In October 1952, the colonial governor, Sir Evelyn Baring, declared a state of emergency. British troops were flown in from England. The Royal Air Force bombed the forests. Hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu were rounded up and forced into villagization camps, where they were subjected to forced labor, torture, and starvation. Kenyatta's position during the Mau Mau uprising has been the subject of intense historical debate. What is certain is that Kenyatta publicly condemned violence and called for non-violent resistance. At a famous rally in Nyeri in July 1952, he told the crowd, "We are not fighting for our freedom with violence. We want freedom through peaceful means." However, many historians argue that Kenyatta knew more about Mau Mau than he admitted. Some claim that he was the movement's secret leader. Others maintain that he was a moderate who was caught between radical militants and an intransigent colonial government. What is beyond dispute is that the British used Kenyatta's association with Mau Mau as a pretext to destroy him. On October 20, 1952, British police raided Kenyatta's home and arrested him. He was charged with managing and being a member of the Mau Mau Society, which had been declared illegal. The trial was a spectacle. It lasted 5 months. The prosecution presented dubious witnesses, including one who later admitted to perjury. The judge, a British colonial appointee, was openly hostile. Kenyatta defended himself with dignity and intelligence. In his final statement, he declared, "I have done my duty to my country and to my people. I am not ashamed of anything I have done." On April 8, 1953, Kenyatta was convicted and sentenced to 7 years of hard labor. The sentence was to be followed by indefinite restriction. Kenya is a country of peace, Kenyatta told the court, and the people of Kenya are peace-loving people. "I am not guilty." He was sent to Lokitong, a remote prison in the desolate northwestern region of Kenya. His years in prison would test his resilience like nothing before. Kenyatta spent nearly 9 years in detention, first at Lokitong, then at Lodwar, and finally at Maralal. These were harsh years. The prisons were primitive, the food was meager, and the isolation was extreme. Lokitong, in the remote Turkana region of northern Kenya, was a desolate outpost surrounded by barren hills and scorching heat. The cells were made of stone and mud, with no furniture except a mat on the floor. He was separated from his family, his colleagues, and his people. His wife, Grace Wahu, could visit only rarely, and his children grew up knowing their father primarily through letters and photographs. The British hoped that by removing Kenyatta, the Mau Mau rebellion would collapse. They were wrong. The Mau Mau War continued until 1960, claiming thousands of lives. The British military campaign was one of the most brutal counterinsurgency operations in colonial history. An estimated 20,000 Mau Mau fighters and civilians were killed. The British officially recorded 1,800 people killed by Mau Mau, mostly Africans who were seen as collaborators. European settler deaths numbered just 32. These numbers alone tell a devastating story about the nature of the conflict. The British campaign was marked by atrocities that were covered up for decades. Recent scholarship, based on documents discovered at the Hanslope Park Archive in Britain, has documented systematic torture, castration, beatings, sexual violence, and starvation in the detention camps. The largest camp, at Ola, became infamous when 11 detainees were beaten to death by guards in March 1959. The Ola massacre caused outrage in Britain and internationally. Even within the British Parliament, there were voices of protest. The Labour MP Barbara Castle led a campaign for an inquiry. The massacre was a public relations disaster for the colonial government. It became clear that the British could not hold Kenya forever through force alone. While Kenyatta was in prison, a new generation of African leaders emerged in Kenya. Tom Mboya, a charismatic Luo trade unionist, and Ojinga Odinga, another prominent Luo leader, built political organizations that transcended ethnic lines and reached across the colony. Mboya organized the Kennedy Airlift, a scholarship program funded by the United States that sent hundreds of Kenyan students to American universities, including a young man named Barack Obama Sr., the father of the future American president. Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana had achieved independence in 1957, and the winds of change were sweeping across Africa like a wildfire. In 1960, the British government finally accepted the principle of African majority rule in Kenya. A constitutional conference was held at Lancaster House in London. The Kenyan delegation, led by Mboya, Odinga, and Ronald Ngala of the Kenya African Democratic Union, presented a united front in demanding Kenyatta's release. The British resisted fiercely. Colonial Secretary Ian MacLeod, though considered a liberal by conservative standards, argued that Kenyatta was a dangerous extremist who would lead Kenya into chaos and communist alignment. But the myth of Kenyatta as a terrorist was fading. International pressure mounted. The newly independent African states made Kenyatta's release a condition of their diplomatic relations with Britain. In 1961, the Kenya African National Union, KONU, was formally established, with Kenyatta as its president in absentia. KONU won the 1961 elections decisively but refused to form a government unless Kenyatta was freed. The deadlock could not continue indefinitely. The British economy needed stability in Kenya, and the settlers needed a political settlement. On August 14, 1961, after nearly 9 years of imprisonment and restriction, Jomo Kenyatta was finally released. He was 60 years old. His hair had turned white. His face was lined with the marks of suffering and age. But his spirit was unbroken. He was greeted by vast, ecstatic crowds celebrating in the streets of Nairobi. When he spoke, his voice was measured but firm. He did not call for vengeance. He called for unity, for reconciliation, and for hard work. He understood that the time for rebellion was over, and the time for building had begun. The final stage of the journey was a series of constitutional conferences in London in 1962 and 1963. Kenyatta led the KONU delegation with masterful diplomacy. He balanced the demands of the Kikuyu, the Luo, the Kamba, the Luhya, the Kalenjin, the Mijikenda, the Maasai, and the coastal peoples. He negotiated with the white settlers who feared African rule and what it might mean for their farms and fortunes. He reassured the British government that an independent Kenya would protect property rights, remain in the Commonwealth, and align itself with the West. He promised that Kenya would be a stable, capitalist democracy, not a socialist or communist state. On December 12, 1963, Kenya became independent. At a midnight ceremony in Nairobi's Uhuru Gardens, the Union Jack was lowered for the last time and the new Kenyan flag, with its bold stripes of black, red, and green, and the white-edged Maasai shield at the center, was raised to the cheers of hundreds of thousands. Jomo Kenyatta, the former prisoner, the former exile, the former clerk, became the first Prime Minister of independent Kenya. He was approximately 58 or 59 years old, depending on which birth date one accepts. The journey from the dusty paths of Gatundu to the grand halls of State House had taken a lifetime. It had been a journey of suffering, learning, struggle, and ultimately triumph. Kenya became a republic on December 12, 1964, exactly 1 year after independence. Jomo Kenyatta became its first president. The task ahead was monumental. Kenya was a poor country with an economy dominated by white settlers and Asian merchants. The infrastructure was designed to extract resources for Britain, not to serve Kenyans. The population was divided along ethnic lines, with the Kikuyu, Luo, Luhya, Kamba, and Kalenjin being the largest groups. The colonial legacy of a divide and rule had left deep wounds. Kenyatta's domestic policy was defined by 3 pillars: reconciliation, economic development, and political consolidation. The reconciliation policy was embodied in his famous slogan Harambee, a Swahili word meaning "let us all pull together." Harambee became the national motto. Kenyatta urged Kenyans to set aside ethnic rivalries and work collectively for national progress. He reached out to the white settlers who had not fled. He told them they had nothing to fear. He appointed Europeans and Asians to government positions. This policy of reconciliation was controversial. Many Kenyans, especially those who had fought in the Mau Mau, felt betrayed. They had sacrificed everything for freedom, and now they saw the same settlers keeping their land. Kenyatta's response was pragmatic. Kenya needed the skills, capital, and technology of the white settlers. Expelling them would ruin the economy. On economic development, Kenyatta pursued a capitalist, pro-Western path. He encouraged foreign investment, especially from Britain. He built roads, schools, hospitals, and dams. The economy grew at an impressive rate, averaging over 6% per year during the 1960s. Coffee, tea, and tourism became major sources of foreign exchange. Nairobi transformed from a colonial backwater into a modern city with skyscrapers, highways, and a growing middle class. But the benefits of this growth were not evenly distributed. The gap between rich and poor widened. Land remained concentrated in the hands of a few, including Kenyatta's own family and political allies. Corruption, which would plague Kenya for decades, began to take root. Kenyatta's political consolidation was more controversial. He built a strong centralized state. Opposition parties were pressured, and Kenya effectively became a one-party state under KONU. Critics were arrested or intimidated. The most famous political conflict was the rift between Kenyatta and his vice president, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga. Odinga was a Luo and a socialist who advocated for a more radical redistribution of land and wealth. The conflict between the two men was both ideological and ethnic. In 1966, Odinga resigned and formed his own party, the Kenya People's Union (KPU). The government harassed KPU members. In 1969, after a violent confrontation in Kisumu between police and KPU supporters, the party was banned and Odinga was detained. By the early 1970s, Kenyatta's rule was increasingly authoritarian. His inner circle, known as the Kiambu Mafia because of their Kikuyu origins from the Kiambu district, grew wealthy through land deals and government contracts. Dissent was not tolerated. The press was muzzled. Members of parliament who opposed the government risked detention without trial. Yet Kenyatta remained genuinely popular among many Kenyans. To them, he was Mzee, the wise elder. He was the man who had led them out of colonialism. He was the father of the nation. His speeches, with their proverbs and parables, resonated with ordinary people. He projected an image of dignity, wisdom, and authority. In foreign policy, Kenyatta was a staunch anti-communist and a close ally of the West. This was not merely ideological. It was pragmatic. Kenya needed aid, investment, and military support. The West, particularly Britain and the United States, was happy to provide it in exchange for a reliable ally in East Africa. Kenya became a Cold War battleground, but on the western side. The CIA and British intelligence had close ties with Kenyan security services. The port of Mombasa and the air bases near Nairobi were used by Western militaries. Kenya was a haven for Western businesses and tourists. Kenyatta played a leading role in the Organization of African Unity, OAU, the precursor to the African Union. He helped mediate conflicts in other African countries. He hosted OAU summits in Nairobi. He was respected as one of the elder statesmen of African independence, along with Nkrumah, Nyerere, and Senghor. However, Kenyatta's relationship with his fellow African leaders was complex. He was wary of Nkrumah's Pan-Africanist ambitions and what he saw as Nkrumah's socialist radicalism. He was suspicious of Nyerere's experiment with African socialism, Ujamaa, in neighboring Tanzania. The two countries, despite their shared borders and linguistic ties, pursued very different development paths. Tanzania under Nyerere was socialist, egalitarian, and critical of the West. Kenya under Kenyatta was capitalist, hierarchical, and aligned with the West. One of Kenyatta's most significant foreign policy achievements was hosting the 1973 OAU summit in Addis Ababa, where he was elected chairman of the OAU. In his address, he called for African unity while respecting the sovereignty of individual states. He urged African nations to settle their differences peacefully and to focus on economic development. On the issue of Southern Africa, Kenyatta was a vocal critic of apartheid in South Africa and colonial rule in Rhodesia and Mozambique. He provided support, though limited, to liberation movements. Kenya was at the frontline state in rhetoric if not always in practice. Kenyatta also established diplomatic relations with China, despite his pro-Western orientation. This was a pragmatic move. China was investing in African infrastructure projects and offering aid without the political strings attached by Western donors. The Chinese built the Taifa Road in Nairobi and supported agricultural projects. Kenyatta also maintained cordial relations with Israel, which had a significant presence in Kenya providing agricultural and military assistance. When the OAU condemned Israel after the 1967 Six-Day War, Kenyatta remained measured in his criticism. This pro-Israel stance was partly driven by Israel's support for Kenya during the independence struggle and partly by the presence of a small but influential Jewish community in Kenya. Kenyatta traveled widely as president, visiting the United States, Britain, China, India, and numerous African countries. He was received with the honors due to a founding father. His meetings with U.S. Presidents Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon underscored Kenya's importance as a Cold War ally. Johnson once called Kenyatta one of the great statesmen of our time. Jomo Kenyatta died on August 22, 1978, at the age of about 87. He had been in declining health for several years. His death marked the end of an era. He was succeeded by his vice president, Daniel Arap Moi, who would rule Kenya for another 24 years. Kenyatta's legacy is complex and contested. On the positive side, he is revered as the father of the nation, the man who led Kenya to independence and held it together during the fragile early years. He presided over a period of economic growth and relative stability. He built the institutions of a modern state, the civil service, the military, the judiciary, the university system. He promoted education and made primary schooling accessible to many Kenyans. He established the Kenyatta National Hospital, the Kenyatta International Conference Center, and the University of Nairobi. He also left a legacy of reconciliation embodied in the Harambee spirit. His call for unity across ethnic lines, while imperfectly realized, set a standard that later leaders would invoke. The fact that Kenya did not descend into the kind of civil war that devastated countries like Nigeria, Sudan, or the Congo during its first decades of independence owe something to Kenyatta's leadership. But there is also a darker side to Kenyatta's legacy. His economic policies concentrated wealth in the hands of a small elite. His family and political allies accumulated vast fortunes through land deals and government contracts. The pattern of corruption and ethnic favoritism that would cripple Kenya in later decades was established under his watch. The political repression of the late 1960s and 1970s set a precedent for authoritarian rule. The detention without trial, the harassment of journalists, the suppression of opposition, these became tools used by his successors. The land question, the very issue that had sparked the Mau Mau uprising, was never resolved. The millions of Kenyans who had been dispossessed by colonialism saw their land given not to them, but to political insiders. The Mau Mau veterans, the heroes of the liberation struggle, were marginalized and forgotten. Many died in poverty. It was only in the 2000s, decades after Kenyatta's death, that the British government finally acknowledged the torture and abuse committed during the emergency and paid compensation to some victims. And it was only in 2013 that Kenyan Mau Mau veterans were officially recognized as heroes of the liberation struggle. Kenyatta's views on women and gender were conservative by today's standards. He had multiple wives, a practice acceptable in Kikuyu tradition but controversial in his public role. His government did little to advance women's rights or to challenge patriarchal structures. Yet, for all the criticisms, Jomo Kenyatta remains a towering figure. When Kenyans today speak of Mzee, there is still a note of reverence in their voices. He is the founding father, the burning spear who freed the nation. His face appears on the 1,000-shilling note, the highest denomination of Kenyan currency. His name adorns streets, schools, hospitals, and universities across the country. The Kenya his successors have built is far from perfect. Corruption, inequality, ethnic violence, and political repression continue to plague the nation. But Kenya also has a vibrant civil society, a dynamic economy, and a resilient people. The foundations of that Kenya were laid by Jomo Kenyatta, the man from Gatundu who became the father of a nation. His story is not simply the story of one man. It is the story of Africa, of colonialism's brutality, of the struggle for freedom, of the compromises and contradictions of independence, and of the enduring hope that tomorrow can be better than today. Historians continue to debate Kenyatta's role in the Mau Mau uprising. Was he a master strategist who secretly directed the movement while publicly condemning violence? Or was he a moderate who lost control of radical forces? The evidence is inconclusive. What is clear is that the British used Mau Mau as a pretext to imprison him, and Kenyatta never fully revealed the truth. Another debate concerns Kenyatta's economic policies. Critics argue that he preserved the colonial economic structure, merely replacing white elites with black ones. Supporters counter that rapid growth and stability required continuity and that transitions are always messy. In the broader context of Pan-African history, Kenyatta occupies a unique place. Unlike Nkrumah, who dreamed of a United States of Africa, Kenyatta was a nationalist who focused on building a strong Kenyan state. Unlike Nyerere, who experimented with socialism, Kenyatta was a capitalist. Unlike Sankara, who sought radical social transformation, Kenyatta was a gradualist. Yet Kenyatta's contribution to Pan-Africanism should not be underestimated. His book Facing Mount Kenya was a foundational text in the African intellectual renaissance. It asserted, with scholarly rigor, that African civilizations were sophisticated and complete. It refused the colonial narrative of African inferiority. It demanded respect for African culture and history. Kenyatta also demonstrated that Africans could govern themselves. When skeptics said that Kenya was too divided, too poor, too backward to be independent, Kenyatta proved them wrong. He showed that an African country could be stable, prosperous, and respected on the world stage. Today, as Africa continues its long march toward true liberation, Kenyatta's life offers lessons. It reminds us that freedom is not given, it is taken. It reminds us that leadership requires both vision and pragmatism. It reminds us that the struggle does not end with independence, but continues in the building of just, prosperous, and inclusive societies. Jomo Kenyatta, the burning spear, lit a fire that still burns in the hearts of Kenyans and Africans everywhere.